I think bad behaviour is an integral part of cities, and when you can't see it on the plan, you need desperately to look for it, in my view. And a person extremely well equipped to reference bad behaviour and to encourage a great many art students and students going through the university and the School of Art for the last several years has been very badly behaved in his punk days, when he was an extremely fine and important member of a legendary band. All bands that get old and fat call themselves legendary, don't they, John? This is the three Johns, included John Hyatt.
It's the guitar player who's fat, by the way. As long as this is not being videoed in Chicago, I should be all right. Okay, I'm going to talk about a project that I did for Exchange Square, which you'll probably know, which is the project that I called Manchester's Tilted Windmills. First of all, a bit of a poem. Anecdote of the jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. Wallace Stevens' poem, I've included Wallace Stevens' poem because I think it relates exactly to what it means to place an artwork in a public space. What he's doing in the poem is he's placing a jar, a perfect form, which is evoked by the rhymes in the poem. He's placing that man-made cultural form, or woman-made cultural form, on a hillside in Tennessee, and the wilderness, as he calls it, the landscape, arranges itself around that focus. So the chaos of the landscape becomes defined by the placement of that thing in the wilderness. And I think we must remember, though we're in the middle of a bustling city, and I certainly remember it today because being a recovering cancer patient, the reflective surfaces in this building and the sound quality is absolutely horrendous for me. And I feel like one of Roger's confused avatars. So I think we must remember that the wilderness is never very far away. And even though we live in these cultured environments, that if we ask the contemporary physicist down at the quantum level, there's just a grey, undulating waveform soup going on. And this is actually the environment within which we exist. And if we asked an Eastern mystic, that we would get the same answer, that there is actually nothing here but an interdependent, interpenetrating set of waveforms. So even though we think we're living in the solidity of an urban environment, we're actually living in more or less nothing at all, or at the most, a sort of interpenetrating set of electrical or magnetic signals. And I think that's important to remember because I think there's a global ecological imperative that the world is not about iconic buildings. The world is not about things. The world is about the transport between things. It's about the ideas that we share, and it's about the interdependence of us all in a global ecology. Because we are nature's storytellers. No other creature on the planet tells stories like the humans do. When we tell stories, what we're doing is we're organizing that wilderness. We're finding our place. We're inventing time. We're inventing memories of the past. We're inventing ideas and dreams of the future in which we can place ourselves and position ourselves in order to function in the world. We place and we make narratives in the wilderness, and those are the jars that we place. We've always been the same across different cultures. We place objects in order to understand the wild. We place totems. We place objects that contain our stories, that have the histories of our tribe contained within them, that connect the earth with the sky and us in between, that narrate our spiritual ideas of the world. And when these totems like these are actually taken away, a lot of these totem poles were stolen by places like the British Museum. When they're taken away, you're not just taking an object, you're actually taking the identity and the personality and the history and the whole culture of the tribe or people that own the object. So when humans place a vertical stick in the floor whenever their nomadic existence takes them from place to place, the placement of that stick in the ground places them at the center of the universe. It places them at a place that they call home. And when they move, they can take that stick with them and place that stick, like the jar, in a different place on the earth. But it, again, makes their placement of that stick, makes them at the center of somewhere they can call home. It generates ideas of north, south, east, west. It generates ideas of above and below. And that's why Roman villas are the same wherever you go around the world. The architecture is the same. Or mosques are designed on the same principle wherever you go in the world. They all point towards Mecca. We in the British West and the Roman West are also very keen on making totemic vertical structures, usually to do with battle, to do with war, and they also contain our ideas of who we are, our cultural identities. So that's why we place Nelson on the top of something that looks like a giant geyser or a fountain, based on the Roman model of Trajan's column. And when those vertical structures are destroyed, it creates a great damage and a great threat to our cultural identity. It creates fear and it creates chaos. And chaos is never that very far away. So in Manchester, when the bomb went off, it was very similar. It was unexpected. It was unexplained. It created a confusion. Like Herman Melville says in Moby Dick, you're no safer by your evening fire with a poker by your side than you are at the front of a whaleboat with a harpoon in your hand. It ripped apart the comfortable domesticity of our everyday lives. So when I was asked to come up with some ideas for a public artwork, well, it was a competition, which I put an idea in for. I had to think, what was public art? And those ideas of placing something and making stories were central to the idea that I came up with. Public art's used to interpret. Public art is used to animate. It's used by global cities to market, to compete in a world competitive city market. So Barcelona versus Manchester for economic wealth is part of the equation. And it's also used to educate people about where they live or their heritage. So what did I have to think of? What stories did I have to place something within when I came to do the ideas for Exchange Square? Well, firstly, I had to place something within Martha's design, which, having never met Martha, I just went from the actual design itself, which I took to be a sort of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure you will, a Californian beach idea, with grey granite as wet sand and with Yorkshire sandstone as dry sand. And the original proposal had palm trees going, where the windmills are now, had palm trees going across the top. But when the ideas were exhibited in Manchester Town Hall, the people of Manchester said, what have palm trees got to do with Manchester? We don't like that bit, hence the competition. But I wanted to stay true to the concept, to the idea. So I wanted to find a form that was similar in shape to a palm tree, but also connected to Mancunian history. So I took the idea of Wakes Weeks and holidays in Blackpool and the children's windmills that are placed in sandcastles, and basically went along to Arup and said, look, I want you to help me make this. And it was a cardboard windmill on a stick. I said, but I want you to help me make it big, and I want to stick it in the middle of Exchange Square. And they said, oh, yeah, all right. And I thought, well, I can work with these people, because anybody else would have told me to get lost. So I also had to insert the artwork into the story that Manchester had of itself. We've already heard from Jim how Manchester took its trip to Barcelona, and basically I realized that Manchester at that time wanted to be Barcelona. It was bragging about in the local paper, in the Manchester Evening News, about how that year Manchester had more sunshine than Barcelona. And so the tilted windmill was deliberately Spanish in idea. It comes from Don Quixote. Don Quixote went out tilting at windmills. So it's a visual and word-based pun. Hence the shape. The shape's a very difficult shape to model. I'd like to see it in that Arup fly-through, because I tried at the time to consult wind experts about how to construct it, because it's actually, though simple, it's actually quite complicated to computer model, because I was interested in finding out how the wind moved in Exchange Square. And because Exchange Square is triangular with a curve on the front of the building of the Corn Exchange, as it was, the triangle, nobody could model it. And 5 independent wind experts came up with the conclusion, you can't trust the wind. So I lay awake all night because I was worried that they might actually blow over and slice through some child as they walked across Exchange Square. And at 5 in the morning, I came up with the answer to perforate them and motorize them, because they said they may not ever go round, there might not be enough wind, or there might be a gust of wind which would cause them to blow off and injure somebody. I actually had the vision for the windmills in a split second when I was standing in Exchange Square bomb site, when it was Marks and Spencer's, as it was, the frontage of Selfridges had been constructed. And I was sitting there, and the Corn Exchange, it was a sunny day in July, and the Corn Exchange was behind me, reflected in the window of Marks and Spencer's, and it was wavering in the heat, and it just looked like a giant sandcastle. And so the actual idea for the children's windmill shape came in a split second at that time. I produced some drawings for it. I produced a few different ideas. This is a drawing of a different model windmill. Obviously, it couldn't obstruct the storefront because people needed to see how that worked. So I also wanted to connect the medieval centre, the spiritual centre, the cathedral, which of course is older than the cathedral. It must have been a stone circle on that spot years before the cathedral. The sacredness of the space. I wanted to connect that medieval idea with the postmodern shopping centre through the Industrial Revolution. So the windmills, Jim Chapman always wanted me to make them more elegant. He kept saying, John, you could make them so much more elegant, you know. And I'd say, no, I want them clunky and industrial. They've got to relate to the industrial history of Manchester. So that in their windmillness, they relate to the medieval. In their clunkiness, they relate to the industrial. And then they connect to the postmodern shopping centre. These motors were designed by Mantec. Unfortunately, they no longer rotate. If there's anybody from the council here, I would appreciate somebody looking at that. We had a big argument in a porter cabin on the website, on the building site. There were 23 people on a hot July in summer. There was the city council there. There was Manchester Millennium Limited. Jim Chapman was there. Arup were there. McNicholas were there. other people, everybody who was engaged in the project was there, and there wasn't enough money to build 5 windmills. And so it was like 12 angry men. It was getting hotter and hotter. Everybody got hard hats and big boots and fluorescent jackets. And nobody asked the artist, because if the artist speaks, it's like a monkey speaking. Nobody knows what the artist is going to say. So everybody was arguing. The council was saying there's not enough money. Jim was saying, but there have got to be 5, because 5 is an aesthetic number. 4 is not an aesthetic number. And I was just sitting there, and in the end I was just getting too hot, and I said, look, 4 is an odd number. And the place went silent. I said, actually, 4 is 2 odd numbers. It's 3 and it's 1. We'll have 1, and then we'll have a gap, and then we'll have 3. And the council panicked, and they said, we'll find the money, we'll find the money. So it's ironic now that when I came down the other week, there were only 4. And nobody asked me because they've took one away for the tram. So they no longer go round, and there's now only 4 of them. So the best laid plans of artists, say. But as Marcel Duchamp said, an artwork is only completed by its audience. And the work of art is actually for the people. And the people, I've sat in Exchange Square and I've observed people coming around the corner and seeing them. And the first reaction, I'm pleased to say, is usually a smile, because I did want them to be a fun thing. They were a millennium thing. They were a curative thing after the bombing. And I think I've succeeded in that. But I also took the precaution, of course, conceptually, that public art is usually either very much liked or very much hated. And conceptually, the idea that they're Don Quixote's windmills was important to me, because they can be seen as monsters. So they mark place, they punctuate and add syntax to the city, but importantly, they're inserted into the things that we are, and what we are is our stories of ourselves, and that, I'm afraid, is all we are. So there's no such thing as an object. When you look at them, they're not objects. They're containers. They're containers that are transient, even though they're made of metal. They won't last forever. The Industrial Revolution will soon disappear from this world. The wilderness will return, and if we're not careful, we won't be here to enjoy it. So I encourage you all to look after the planet, and remind you all that everything changes, even though sometimes we wouldn't like it to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. 3 and 1. What a great argument. Terrific.